Hi, I'm Dr. J. Varma, and welcome to Thermometer. On this channel, I check the temperature of health in the US and around the world, and I give you expert insights on infectious diseases and public health. This is our weekly episode of Inside Outbreaks. On these episodes, I review the latest outbreaks of infectious diseases occurring here in the US and around the world, the outbreaks that you need to know about. And I do this with my friend and colleague, Jon Epstein, veterinarian, virologist, and disease ecologist who, like me, has spent his career tracking dangerous infectious diseases all across the earth. Thanks, Jon, for joining me today.
Thanks, Jay. It's great to see you. How was your weekend?
Good. Yeah, it was good so far. And I'm curious, you've been traveling around the world, though, it sounds like. And so tell me about your trip last week.
I know it's true. Actually, it was a lot of fun. I don't normally get to go to what would be considered vacation spots. I'm typically going to, pretty rough and tumble developing country areas. This was the opposite of that. I had a few days in Paris for a meeting, which was a lot of fun. It had been a while since I was there, and I got to shake the rust off my French a little bit. So it was good fun.
Yeah, no. It's great. Paris is one of those places where you get when you get to go to a meeting there, you're obviously particularly excited because it is such a lovely and incredible place. And, I worked in international TB for many years, and because they're the oldest NGO that works on tuberculosis, the International Union Against TB and Lung Disease was based in Paris. I got to go, every year for a couple of years, which is just amazing.
It's so nice. And I have to say, they've really nailed the outdoor dining culture. I mean, every single bistro and restaurant has sidewalk seating, and you got to be comfortable with sitting elbow to elbow with people, but it's just got its own flair, its own kind of enjoyable thing. And the weather was beautiful. It was in the 70s and it was sunny. So it was just really perfect for sitting outside and having a meal.
Yeah, that sounds great. I mean, I think one of the other things that Paris has done incredibly well is basically redesigning the city around pedestrians, right?
Oh, yeah.
There have been so many changes there, over the past 10, 15 years and stuff. And I know New York was trying to model them, but, getting stuff changed in New York, as you know, is a bit of a challenge.
Oh, you're right. It was so walkable. It was so easy. I don't even think I got on the metro because I moved around to the different neighborhoods on foot, and the weather was really great. So that's true. One thing that took some getting used to, it's really funny, is there's still a lot of smoking there. So even sitting in these outdoor cafes, I mean, on either side, I just wasn't used to smelling cigarette smoke, but it was pretty common still.
Yeah, we talk a lot about in public health about how far behind the US is in terms of basically the way our healthcare system works. We spend the most of any economically advanced country, and we have the least returns on it. And if you look at things like infant mortality and you look at life expectancy. But interestingly enough, there are two ways in which the US, at least historically, and I say historically because obviously things are rapidly changing here in the US right now, has been ahead of Europe. Is number one is tobacco control. Tobacco is really the number one killer of people. It causes everything from chronic lung disease and heart attacks to a range of cancers in basically every part of your body. Always been ahead of Europe in that regard, number one. And number two is vaccinations. Right. A lot of countries in Europe still have a lot of vaccine conspiracy theories, don't have, really strong immunization requirements. And the US has historically been, we haven't had to worry about measles here in the United States, but you did have to worry about it in Europe. So,
yeah, well, I really hope that Europe does better and catches up, and B, that the US doesn't fall behind, which we look like we're in a position to do. But these are really important, to me, very basic things and public health successes in terms of the tobacco and anti-smoking campaign here in the United States over the last few decades. It's really made a huge difference.
No, without question. And I have another segment on this week for those viewers with Dr. Tom Farley called Inside CDC, where we're actually talking about some of the dangerous ways in which the U.S. is backsliding, specifically when it comes to things like tobacco smoke. But moving from one exotic place, France and Paris, to another, our first topic this week is gonorrhea in Alaska. I'm not sure those are two words that normally go, hand in hand, of course. But a few weeks ago, the Alaska Department of Health released an alert about gonorrhea. And what they were reporting about was 27 patients that were detected in 2024, so last year, with something called disseminated gonococcal infection. And that basically means a form of gonorrhea that goes beyond your genitals and damages other parts of your body. And they reported that this is 3 times the number of this type of severe gonorrhea cases that they had in 2023 and 10 times the number that they had in 2022. And Alaska health officials right now are trying to do a special type of testing called genomic sequencing, something we've talked about on this episode before, to figure out what is going on.
Yeah, well, it's one of those typical cases where if we stop paying attention, if we take out our monitoring, our eyes and ears, we don't really understand processes and we don't always notice these increases. So it's really important that this has come to the fore as an issue. In fact, correct me if I'm wrong, I think STIs in general have started to increase over the last couple of years. And so people don't always think about some of the really systemic damage they can do to your body beyond just the sort of immediate, genital area.
Yeah, exactly. And the thing about the most common bacterial STDs we have, gonorrhea, chlamydia, syphilis, we don't have vaccines for these. So really the only way to control them is to screen people, get them diagnosed really early, and to treat them. And what happens with gonorrhea is it normally infects you through your genitalia. If you have a penis, it's going to infect you there. If you have a vagina, it's going to infect you in your cervix. And if you get it detected and treated early, there are no complications from it. The reason we worry about this disease isn't really so much because of this invasive disease, which I'll talk about in a moment. We worry about it because it can cause infertility, right? And so, it's one of these real struggles that we face. You hear a lot of talk about infertility on both sides of the aisle, from Republicans to Democrats. They're worried about fertility problems. But, unfortunately, a lot of people are skittish about when they talk about STIs. But one of the ways you can promote fertility is by helping to detect and treat things like gonorrhea and chlamydia early, because they can cause infertility in women and in men. The other reason we worry about gonorrhea is that it develops drug resistance really easily. It has these kind of wily mechanisms by which every 5 to 10 years, if you introduce a new antibiotic to stop it, it mutates. And right now we have only one antibiotic left. And so what we're dealing with in Alaska is an unusual outbreak of disseminated gonococcal infection. So that means it infects you in your genitalia and then it spreads through your bloodstream. It can infect your heart valves and cause something called endocarditis. It can infect your joints and cause arthritis. And of course, just by going through your bloodstream, it can make you extremely sick. So, I'm curious, Jon, what would be some of your theories about, why a pathogen might be causing, something different than we might normally see?
I think we often forget that, disease is more than just the pathogen that's making you sick and your body's response to it, but it's like a dance. And that over time at a population level, as people get infected, and this is true in animals too, pathogens have to overcome obstacles like immune systems to be more effective and be able to persist. And one way of doing that is by mutating and evolving. And so sometimes that changes the clinical syndrome and the presentation of a pathogen we've known about for a long time. And another thing that comes to mind is when I think about Mpox, what we used to call monkeypox, which was historically thought of as, known to be a zoonotic pathogen that was prevalent in Central Africa, and people got it through contact with animals. But in this current epidemic that we're dealing with, we have seen sexual transmission. And that is a new transmission pathway that we didn't historically think about as being epidemiologically important. And so again, is it that we weren't aware of it, or are the pathogens changing slightly and evolving to be more successful at spreading and persisting in a population?
Yeah, I mean, we can think about, we think, is the pathogen changing? Are the people changing, right? Is there something about the genetics or their health conditions or even their microbiome, right, that's changing? Or is there something about the different ways people are being infected, right? Gonorrhea, we normally think of as a disease that's, if it's a man and a woman having sex, it's sort of, penis and vagina and cervix. But there's oral infection, there's anal infection, there's other routes as well. So yeah, it's a very complex system. And I think what's, calling out to a lot of the issues that we've been talking about on this show, and, people like you and me are talking about with our friends and colleagues all the time, is normally this is the type of thing that CDC would be investigating. CDC maintains specialized laboratories and specialized field investigators that try to figure out these things. And the whole reason you want to figure them out is you want to keep them contained to a population, let's say in Anchorage, before it becomes a problem in Los Angeles or New York, Chicago, or anywhere else around the country. But unfortunately, as part of this massive purge of the health workforce on April 1st, led by RFK as part of supposedly making America healthier again, they shut down CDC's STIs lab. That is the lab that basically is the global reference center. I mean, global, like WHO reference center for testing gonorrhea strains to figure out what they're resistant to and not, how their genetics might change. And they've just basically shuttered and it doesn't mean shutting the lab. It means firing all the experts as well as the field services branch, which is the group that goes out and historically does all this contact tracing.
Yeah, and there's this real temptation, and you hear this discussed now, to delegate these responsibilities to the states. The states should have the responsibility to do surveillance, to report on diseases. But the problem is when you lose your centralized coordinating body, things don't always get communicated to other states. A state might do a good job at detecting and responding to a particular disease outbreak, but if the data isn't systematically shared and accessible across the country, then you're liable to, have outbreaks elsewhere that might have been prevented if there was a centralized resource. So that's the other risk of disseminating responsibility beyond the federal government.
Yeah, I mean, that's an excellent point because, a lot of the work that I did overseas was trying to help countries shift away from what we consider like a federated response where every locality does its own thing to actually having a shared system. I mean, the reason I was in Africa, that US taxpayer dollars paid for me to be in Africa, was to set up a disease surveillance and response system that crossed borders in Africa so countries could rapidly and readily share information exactly for this reason. I remember, God, it was probably 15, 20 years ago, Germany had a massive outbreak of E. coli 0157, it used to be called Jack in the Box E. coli. And one of the reasons they struggled so much is they have very strong state-based public health systems. And it led them to essentially create a new public health agency modeled after, guess what? CDC. It's called the Robert Koch Institute to, honor the famous German scientist that discovered the causative agent for TB, as well as a number of other important microbiology developments. But yeah, you make an excellent point. Without these centralized programs and systems, it's very hard for everybody in the country to know what's going on and all of the different states to be on alert.
That's right. And, maybe this is an interesting segue we can make into another topic we're going to talk about, but another country where both of us have done a lot of work in, and I know you have familial connections to, is India. And that's a system that has states as opposed to a federal system that are primarily responsible for public health implementation. There is a centralized system, of course, but there's so much financial difference among the states in India. It leads to very, very different capabilities from state to state in terms of public health surveillance, how much they spend on infrastructure, and how effectively they report up to the federal centralized public health system. And one pathogen in particular that I've spent a long time studying and working with is this virus called Nipah virus. And this is something I was really excited to talk about this week, not because I'm happy to see cases of it, but it's because there are cases of it. And the story with Nipah virus, and we'll talk about what it is and how it happens, but it's also an example of how disparate systems within a country can lead to differential ability to detect and respond to cases. So if it's okay with you, maybe I'll just get into it.
Yeah, let's just jump right in. And just for the listeners out there, one of the reasons I'm smirking a little bit, assuming you're watching this, is that, one of the sort of focal areas for Nipah virus in India right now, and what has been essentially the focal point for Nipah virus since it sort of emerged in India, previously had been noted but more in Bangladesh, is actually the state my family's from, where most of my relatives live, which is in Kerala. So John, give us a little bit of education about what Nipah virus is and why does it keep coming back in Kerala?
Yeah. So what is Nipah virus? It might be one of the worst viruses you've never heard about. It's essentially a paramyxovirus related to measles in the same family, but pretty different in terms of what it does clinically. It's carried by large fruit-eating bats that are really common in what we call the old world, Africa and Asia. So these are bats that live in trees, that eat all different kinds of fruit or nectar, and they live in pretty close association with people. And this virus first came to our attention back in 1998 when it caused a pretty serious outbreak on a large pig farm in Malaysia. And it caused a severe coughing and neurologic disease in pigs. They were losing coordination, stopped eating. There were abortion storms on the farm. It was a really serious problem. But what got folks to really notice this is that farmers that were in close contact with these pigs on the farms also got infected, and it caused a really severe central nervous system disease, what we call encephalitis, swelling of the brain and spinal cord, and it killed almost half the people it infected, and it caused a big outbreak in Malaysia, and it crashed the swine industry. So skip ahead a few years, now we're aware of this virus. We also started seeing cases of it in South Asia, Bangladesh and India. And there, slightly different system, this virus was jumping from bats into people, not through pigs or other livestock, but directly through contaminated food. in Bangladesh, where it was first recognized in 2001, people were getting sick by drinking raw date palm sap. This is a cultural delicacy that's been consumed for generations, where people climb up these palm trees, they carve the bark off the tree, and they let the sap flow into these clay collection pots. This happens overnight. And this is almost like sugarcane juice. It's a sweet juice. And then they collect the pots in the morning, and they go door to door locally selling this, and people drink it raw. Well, it turns out this sweet, sugary drink is also really attractive to the bats that can carry Nipah virus. And so, completely accidentally, these bats learn to feed off the shaved part of the trees to lick the flow of sap. And occasionally, they contaminate the sap with saliva or urine or feces. And if that bat happens to be infected with Nipah and is shedding virus, it can contaminate that batch of sap. And that's how people get infected. And so, we started to see these clusters, these outbreaks of encephalitis. And as opposed to what we saw in the Malaysia outbreak, what's different in Bangladesh and India is we see human to human transmission. And that's really what has us concerned about this disease. Nipah has a fatality rate, meaning it kills up to 3/4 of the people it infects, which is huge. When you think about diseases like Ebola, it's in that territory, 50 to 90% fatality, right? So here's a lethal virus that's getting into people through consumption. We're seeing it happen regularly in these seasonal cycles, and it is able to spread from person to person, typically through close contact. So that's the same thing going on in India. And over the past 5 years or so, we started to see frequent spillover and cases of Nipah virus, particularly in southern India, in the state of Kerala, where your family's from. And the mystery is, in Kerala, there isn't date palm sap cultivation. So we have a different way that this virus is getting from bats into people. And it's still a bit of a mystery, but we're seeing this as a highly lethal disease. Kerala happens to have pretty good laboratories and public health infrastructure. So they're doing a great job at detecting these cases when they report to a hospital, contact tracing, and basically stopping spread so that that limits the number of cases. But the real concern is, if this is happening in southern India, these bats live all across South Asia, across the subcontinent. So it is likely that there are human cases happening in other parts of the country that may not have as good surveillance capabilities. So this one has us on our toes, Jay.
Yeah, no, and the reason we're talking about it is, as you and I just alluded to, and the link will be in the description of this, is that there was a report about a 40-year-old woman that was admitted to the emergency department at a hospital and then transferred to a referral hospital. And as you mentioned, the state that my family is from is one of the most economically advanced or socially advanced, let's put it that way, of all of India. It's actually the only place that originally had the first democratic elected communist government. So it's got a really well-established healthcare infrastructure. But yeah, it's been a real mystery why people are getting infected. Where my family is from is traditionally a very it's a tropical area. It produces a lot of, well, historically has produced a lot of fruit, of rice, of tea plantations, and there's jungle. So there's no doubt that there's probably some transmission pathway that's probably similar to what's happening in Bangladesh, but it is curious how that hasn't been detected yet.
Yeah, and it really speaks to, this is a disease to me that really illustrates the connection between wildlife and livestock and human health, because it covers all three. These bats don't tend to get sick when they're infected, so they behave fairly normally. It's a transient 1 or 2 week infection where they're able to spread the virus, but they don't suffer any significant disease. So they'll go about, they'll feed as normally. These bats fly up to about 50 miles in radius looking for food, so they cover a lot of ground. And if they happen to be infected and shedding virus and they're biting into fruit that drops to the ground, and maybe a goat or a dog comes along and eats that fruit, it might get exposed. If it's contaminating a food source that people would eat, that's a way they might get infected. So it's not that there's direct transmission from bats to people through direct contact, but it tends to be contamination of some kind of food. And that's how spillover occurs. And this is the kind of mystery we need to understand and solve in order to put up effective interventions to limit exposure in people.
Yeah. Is there any risk that this could become a problem in the United States? I mean, do those bats live here, or is there some similar species that could carry it that we know
Well,
of?
it's a really great question for a number of reasons. The bats that carry Nipah in Asia and Africa don't live in the Americas at all. So we're in what's called the New World as opposed to the Old World, which is Africa and Asia. So we got plenty of bats. We don't have Nipah virus per se, but when people get exposed to Nipah, it used to happen in kind of remote villages that didn't have much contact. But we have started seeing cases in urban centers like in Dhaka. And, Dhaka is just a plane ride away from New York City or London
Mhm.
or Hong Kong. And so, as usual, the ability for global travel in a short amount of time puts anywhere at risk. Somebody might be infected and not even know that they are. They don't feel sick yet. They get on a plane and go to another city, and there could be limited human transmission. And of course, depending on how good the hospitals are and surveillance, we may not pick up on it. So risk is low, but it is not impossible. And because of global travel, we all have to, stay vigilant now about these types of diseases. Now, the second part of your question, do we have a risk here? What's interesting is we have found related viruses here in the Americas. Nipah virus is in a group of viruses called Hantaviruses, and they don't all cause disease. We don't know about all of the relatives of Nipah virus in this group, but we have found related viruses in opossum in the Americas and in bats around the United States, North America. So we don't need to worry that this is going to emerge here as a big problem based on what we're finding and the viruses we're seeing here. But we're only scratching the surface in terms of what we understand of the geographic extent of some of these viruses and exactly whether or not they have a public health consequence.
Well, it turns out we probably don't have to travel very far, of course, to find dangerous pathogens here in the United States. Because the third topic we wanted to talk about actually relates to hantavirus, which is another highly deadly pathogen that has a very close intersection with animals and wildlife as well. A lot of Americans may not have ever heard of hantavirus until about a month ago, when the famous actor Gene Hackman died at home. And it turned out there was an unusual sequence of events leading to his death. He was, essentially homebound with severe Alzheimer's disease, and his wife was his primary caretaker, and they lived in New Mexico. And it turns out, after an extensive investigation, she actually got hantavirus and died of it. And then because she was Gene Hackman's caretaker, couldn't feed him, get him water, other things like that. And he eventually died from, some complication of Alzheimer's and heart disease. And, just a few weeks after that, and just about 2 weeks ago, we saw a report from California that in Mammoth Lakes, and for anybody who knows California, Mammoth is an amazing ski area. It's probably better than Lake Tahoe, just a few hours south of Lake Tahoe along the Sierra Nevada mountains. There was a report there have been a cluster of deaths in and around Mammoth due to hantavirus. So, Jon, what do you think is going on there?
Well, hantavirus is a pretty widespread virus. It's carried by mice, particularly deer mice, which are common throughout the Western United States. And we have seen outbreaks of hantaviruses historically in the Four Corners area around Colorado and Arizona and Utah. And it doesn't surprise me that we see cases occasionally in California. In fact, we've even seen cases in New York. It was about 15 years ago now that there was somebody on Long Island who was cleaning out their basement. I remember this, and got exposed to mouse droppings and developed hantavirus and was hospitalized and actually died. And so hantavirus can be a pretty serious disease that spread through droppings, urine, and feces of mice.
Yeah, and so the official press release from the local county health department says, and I'll just read it here: we don't have a clear sense of where this young adult, they're referring to the most recent death, may have contracted the virus. The home had no evidence of mouse activity. It says we observed some mice in the workplace, which is not unusual for indoor spaces this time of year in Mammoth Lakes, and we haven't identified any other activities in the weeks before illness that would have increased this person's exposure to mice or their droppings.
It's so interesting. Every once in a while we get this kind of case where there isn't a clear route of exposure. But what we understand about hantaviruses is they don't spread from person to person. So typically you have to be exposed to droppings or excreta from rodents. And so it's possible they have an incomplete history in terms of different environments this person was in. So there must be more to this if they're getting infected, but it's important to understand how.
Yeah, exactly. So we'll keep an eye and obviously bring people up to date if we hear anything more about the spread of hantavirus. But it's just another example, of course, about this important intersection that we have between the environment we live in, the animals that live in that environment, and humans themselves. And
Yeah.
before
I,
we go ahead, Jon.
oh,
Yeah.
sorry, Jay. No, it makes me think too that because rodents live so closely to people and we often have them in our house, and we might think we see rat droppings in our basement or rodent droppings, no big deal. It speaks to one thing you can do to protect yourself is to make sure you wear a mask. I mean, now we all have N95 masks in our house from COVID, but it's a great time if you're going to be sweeping out the basement or doing some spring cleaning or even vacuuming. Wear a mask so that you don't accidentally kick up some dust that might include, rodent droppings, and breathe in something that could make you sick. So that's a great way to protect yourself if you have any kind of rodent activity in your basement.
Yeah, well, there's actually a great transition about the importance of personal protective equipment, because the last piece I wanted to end on was just a little bit of a rant here. And this is, as we know, there's been a widespread outbreak of measles around the country. And unfortunately, our current HHS Secretary, RFK, has highlighted a physician in Texas and labeled him a hero because he is treating measles cases there, not by isolating them and managing them with PPE, and not by encouraging any contacts of them to get either measles immune globulin and or vaccination, but essentially saying that we're going to give them antibiotics and inhaled steroid, and measles is not that big of a deal. And there was a segment on the Rachel Maddow show where they showed a clip of this physician who now has measles himself. And of course, he claims, well, he was vaccinated, and that shows the measles vaccine doesn't work. But in fact, we know that even if you're vaccinated and you're older, as this physician is, if you're constantly being exposed to measles, there is a likelihood that you could get this disease. But of course, his case is mild because he's still able to work. And what really gets me into this rant is not just his use of, steroids and macrolide antibiotics, claiming that they're a cure, but the fact that he was treating patients while he was sick without wearing a mask. And you just highlighted the importance of wearing a mask to protect yourself when you're dealing with feces or areas where you don't know what's in the dust. If you are a physician, your responsibility is to keep your patients healthy. And every child that comes to you may or may not have measles. They may have something else. And if you have a fever, you should not be seeing patients. If you are within 4 days of when you have your rash onset, you should not be seeing patients. And this physician was. So it's just another example of how this real sort of denial about the importance of infectious diseases, it's certainly causing harm by leading people to not be vaccinated, but it's also leading harm by physicians working in this community not using basic safety precautions, which is the highest ethical requirement for a physician. Do no harm in the management of these outbreaks as well.
Yeah, it's a great point. You hate to think that a physician is contributing to the potential spread of measles on top of everything else. And knowing that he might have a patient base who aren't vaccinated, it becomes even more important for him to protect his patients.
Yes, so absolutely. So, that's going to, wrap up our segment this week on Inside Outbreaks. We kind of did a whirlwind tour. We took you all the way from Alaska to India to California, and then to Texas, and then, of course, back to Jon and myself here in New York right now. So we really appreciate all of you watching. If you care about public health as much as the two of us do, please like this episode, hit subscribe, share it with your friends, and we'll be here every week bringing you the latest news on public health and infectious diseases, and specifically teaching you about the outbreaks you need to know about.
Take care.